Thanks very much to everyone from 8-Bit Sheep for helping us organize this inaugural Snowplow Meetup, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really nice to be speaking to you and meet you all. My name's Yali. As Simo said, I'm one of the co-founders at Snowplow. I'm going to give what will hopefully be a short presentation, but can be longer if you come in with lots of interesting questions, which I hope you will. I'm going to cover just a couple of things. What is Snowplow? So hopefully by the end of it, everybody's clear what it is. Often people aren't. And have a bit of a look at our product roadmap, what we hope to be building over the next 12 months. Before I dive in, very quickly, show of hands, how many of you in the audience are using Snowplow today or have used Snowplow? All right, brilliant. Lots of people who haven't used Snowplow. Sorry, I have to check. One of the joys of running an open source project is you never know who's using it and who's not, and sometimes end up speaking to people who know a lot more about Snowplow than me, which is always a bit awkward. So, don't want to fall into that trap tonight. So what is Snowplow? Well, let's start with our company mission. At Snowplow, we want to empower you to take ownership and control of your user data. And this is a statement that needs a little bit of unpicking. What do I mean when I say I want you to take control of your user data? What do I mean by user data, and what does it mean to take ownership and control of that data? User data hopefully shouldn't need a huge amount of explanation. User data is data that describes your users, your customers, and it's a very, very valuable asset. Companies that are good at using this data better understand their users than their competitors, and the companies that are best at this often use it to drive massive competitive advantage. There was a period in history where just a few companies realized this and really used it to their advantage. I think these days it's a very, very well understood, it's not a very controversial thing to say user data is very valuable and needs to be used. One of the interesting things about user data is it's getting more and more interesting and richer all the time. And that's really being driven by connected devices, things like our mobile phones, connected watches, smart TVs, and so on. All these devices mean that more and more of our lives are mediated by digital platforms. And as they are mediated by digital platforms, we have opportunities to track how we're behaving in more and more detail across more and more of our lives. So if I think back to when I was a teenager, which was a long time ago, I'm an old man, user data really meant transaction data, CRM data. It's really a record of what people had bought. And that's not all that interesting. I mean, it's pretty interesting. And it meant that supermarkets like Tesco in the UK that were better at taking that data could use it to really become the UK's #1 supermarket. But user data today is much, much more interesting. It tells us how we fall in love when we use dating apps on our websites. It tells us how we spend our free time playing games. It tells us how we work when we're engaging in productivity apps. My watch even tells me how I sleep, how I manage my health. So there's a huge amount of interesting behavior that's coded in that data, and correctly used, there's an enormous amount of value in it. However, working with user data is really, really difficult. And it's helping companies solve these difficulties that is really our starting point with Snowplow. So why is working with user data so difficult? Well, user data is big data. It's high volume, it's high velocity. A single user engaging, just a few minutes, 5-6 minutes in a mobile app might generate 100 or more lines of data that describe exactly how that user's engaged in the mobile app. So you're quickly talking about very, very large volumes of data, and if you're tracking these things in real time, that's a pretty high data velocity. User data is cross-channel. Most companies today are engaging with their users or engaging with their customers across web, mobile, potentially in-store, different marketing channels, smart TV, linear TV, email, display, social, and so on. And so if you want to build that complete picture of your users, if you want to understand all their behavior and how good a job you're doing of engaging with them, you need to collect that data from many, many different places. So cross-channel creates a data collection problem, But it also creates a data variability problem, because the data that you collect from email is going to look different to the data you collect from web, or the data you collect from mobile, or the data you collect from social. But behavioral data, user data, is intrinsically varied. If I'm a health app, the data that I track about how my users manage their health is going to look totally different than if I'm an online bank and users are in my application managing their finances. You're looking at data that's describing maybe the same people, but performing very, very different activities. And so that data is structured differently, and the activities it represents are totally different. User data is very hard to analyze. Often it's not easy simply to identify a single user across different platforms and channels, which is a necessary precondition before you can build a picture of that user's journey across those different platforms and channels. But even if you've managed to reliably identify that user across different platforms and channels, taking that stream of events, that long list of rows of data that said the user did this and the user did this, and drawing meaning out of it, figuring out who this user is and what they're trying to accomplish, and whether they were successful, and to what extent their behavior was guided by what they wanted versus by how you were moving them back and forth in your application. Those are really difficult questions to unpick in the data. And the types of tooling that we have, both sort of methodological in statistics and technology-wise, don't really help us very much pull out meaning from that data. And because user data is hard to analyze, it's also hard to act on. So to start to address these challenges, we built a data collection platform with the motivation of doing data collection properly. So we can't solve all these problems, but we can start to solve them by doing the data collection piece correctly. So Snowplow is a data collection platform, and the first thing it does is it lets you track your users across different platforms and channels. So yes, you've got to collect data from lots of different places, but the good news is you can use one technology platform to track data from a lot of those. Not all of those, but from many of those. It's scalable, and it can process the data in real time, which is important because the data is high volume and high velocity. And it's built from the ground up for varied data. So each individual Snowplow user can define their own events and their own entities, and the data points that they want to track with those events and entities. And what that means is if you've got an online bank running Snowplow, and if you've got an online game running Snowplow, they might be running exactly the same technology stack, but might be generating and collecting data sets that look totally different, which is good. Those data sets should look totally different. So that tells us what Snowplow does, but how does that give you control and ownership of your data? Well, we've started to unpick some of that. The first thing is that you, the company that has the relationship with the user, you decide what data you want to collect. You don't just decide what data you want to collect, you define the actual structure of the data, and you can change that definition over time, and that's really important. Businesses are living things, they evolve. Your analytics requirements are going to evolve as you become more sophisticated, and you're going to need to change the way that you track data over time as those things happen. And Snowplow gives you the control to do that. That's control that I don't think you can get in many other places. You can decide how the data is processed. You decide how you want to identify your users and count them if you want to know how many users you've got doing different things. And crucially, you decide how you want to divide their journeys up into meaningful units of analysis. It may well be that a session isn't a meaningful unit of analysis for you. Actually, I think sessions are pretty meaningless for any company, but they're still the standard unit of analysis in digital analytics. With something like Snowplow, you can redefine the session or come up with something better. And crucially, all your data is processed on your own cloud. That can be your own AWS account or your own GCP account. Using Snowplow means you can process all your data. You don't have to move that data elsewhere. So having all your data processed in your own environment gives you complete ownership and control over it. It's great from a security perspective, GDPR perspective, but it's also great because it means you have that ability to control what you collect and how it's processed. But crucially, we're not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. We want you to collect data so you can use it to build insight and to act on the data. So how do we do data collection to do that? Well, we deliver the data directly into the places that matter, so you can build that insight and act on it. So we load the data directly into your data warehouse in Redshift, in Snowflake, in BigQuery, in Elasticsearch, into the different data stores. So you can ask whatever question you want of that data, and you can plug in any analytics tool on top of that data. And we've also started supporting loading the data directly into specialist analytics tools that let you do things with the data that are hard to do in a data warehousing environment. So tools like Indicative for doing funnel analysis that isn't so easy to do with sort of business intelligence or SQL-based tools. All the data that's delivered is rich and highly structured. So all the data is a well understood structure or schema, which means it's easy to query. It's high quality because we're validating the data. We're managing data quality as part of the data processing pipeline. And it's rich. We're attaching as many different data points as possible to the data. And that means if you're a data scientist or an analyst, a product manager, a marketing manager, you've got a really robust data set to start with. You're not spending 80% of your time cleaning your data, so you can spend 20% of your time doing something interesting. The data arrives and it's ready to go, ready for the interesting bit. And crucially, the complete data set is available in real time for activation. We publish the full data set to Kinesis or PubSub, so your data-driven applications can grab that data and consume it in real time and do useful things with it. So something that often causes confusion is Snowplow and our open source offering and our paid for offering. So Snowplow started life as an open source platform, and we're very, very committed to open source. We believe that any company in the world should be able to collect their own data, should have access to our technology, and should be able to collect their own data in their own environment and not be locked into a vendor that tells them what questions they should ask of the data or how they use the data. So the open source is out there. It's an ecosystem of different projects that you can put together to build a full data pipeline. We've got a very active community of contributors and users, and all of that is really geared to data engineers and DevOps people that are building data infrastructures at different companies. However, not every company has those teams of DevOps and data engineers, or often if they do have those teams are really, really busy doing things with the data. And so for those companies, we offer a paid-for platform, Snowplow Insights. It does everything that the open source does, so it's built on the open source. But it's easy to set up and run. You don't need any data engineering experience. You don't need any DevOps. There's a web UI. You go in, everything effectively gets set up for you. You have peace of mind. We take care of the setup and running of the pipeline. And really it's geared towards a different set of users. Whereas the open source is geared towards data engineers, Snowplow Insights is geared towards data teams. So typically our customers are teams within companies that are charged with the data strategy at those companies. How should we use data to drive strategic advantage? How do we empower the different teams in our organization to use data more effectively? How do we manage some of the challenges around data compliance and so on? And what we're looking to do in the paid-for platform is build functionality to help that team with some of those complicated workflows, because we see lots of users struggling with some of those workflows. So Snowplow's a kind of a difficult product in the market because there are a lot of companies that we're compared against, but none of them do quite what we do. So on the one hand, we're often compared with the marketing clouds, the Adobe Marketing Cloud or the Google Marketing Cloud. But those are tools that are geared very much towards marketers to effectively help them spend their budget. And they do lots that we don't do, and we do some stuff that they don't do. So we're not directly comparable to them, but we're often compared with them. Similarly, you've got this quite new category of software, customer data platforms that are out there. Companies like Segment and Imparticle, sort of SaaS tools that are aimed again at marketers to help them spend their marketing across different channels in ways that treat the user in a consistent way across those different channels. We're often compared to them. And we're often compared to the kind of ETL as a service providers, companies like Fivetran and Illuma, that specialize in taking data from different third-party APIs and loading it into your cloud data warehouse. So those are all great services, and they all do some element of data collection, but none of them are focused on data collection the way that we are. So if you think about the marketing clouds, if you think about the Adobe Analytics or the Google Analytics, they do data collection from mobile and they do it from web, but they really do it to power a set of reports that come out of the box. They've got one-size-fits-all data models and one-size-fits-all data processing logic, and there are limitations associated with those one-size-fits-all, given all the variation I talked about earlier. And crucially, they don't deliver that full data set in real time. So there's a limit to what you can do with the data in real time in a kind of an activation way. On the customer data hubs side of things, or the customer data platforms, a lot of them support collecting data from lots of different channels and loading that data into your data warehouse. But for them, the data warehouse is just one of many places they let you push the data. And so they don't have our interest either in the quality of the data. They're not doing any validation or quality checks, or in richness of the data. They're typically not doing any, trying to make the data as rich as possible. And so if you compare the data that we load into the data warehouse with the data that they do, there's typically a big difference. The data set that we deliver is just bigger and more interesting. And the ETL as a service vendors plug a very important gap in the market. We can collect data from lots of different places where we can pull the data live and in real time. But there are particular places, there are particular third parties that lock the data behind a third-party API. And the only way to get that data, people like Facebook and AdWords, is to call out to those APIs periodically every hour, every 4 hours, fetch the latest cut of data and load it into your data warehouse. And those tools are great for that, but they don't do what we do. They're really complementary solutions. So hopefully what I've said has given you a clearish idea of what Snowplow does, but put up your hands, shout at me if they don't, or if anything I said doesn't make sense. So with that out of the way, I thought it'd be useful to just give a handful of examples of what companies actually do with Snowplow. So if I look across our users and our user base, I can kind of divide them into two buckets. So one of the interesting things is we've got a whole category of users that have business models and services that just don't fit the classic model that the digital analytics vendors are built to service. So vendors like Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics, those products have really been built around the idea that you're tracking data on a media website or an online retailer, and you've got your shopping basket and you've got your products. But actually, there's a whole host of businesses that don't really fit that model. So one interesting example are two-sided marketplaces. So I'm thinking here of jobs boards, for example, or dating sites, or freelancer sites, or auction sites. These are services where you have two fundamentally different types of users. So on your jobs board, you've got people from companies that are trying to recruit new employees, and you've got job seekers who are looking for jobs. And those are two different users who you're going to deliver two totally different sets of experience, and you need to treat totally separately. So you'll typically have one set of questions around the job seekers, one set of questions around the companies that are looking for to recruit, and another set of questions about how good a job you're doing of matching the two on your service. And asking and answering those questions and performing that type of analysis with the traditional digital analytics toolset is very, very difficult. And so we have a lot of users in that category. But there are other examples of businesses that don't really fit the typical model. So they're aggregator websites that help you find the best way to travel between Helsinki and Berlin, or the best mortgage, or the best insurance product, or the best place to go and stream the latest box set that you want to watch. There are application service providers that provide applications that might be around keeping you entertained, so games or lifestyle apps or productivity tools, where you have whole questions around how your users are engaging, what types of engagement look successful, what is it that makes a user want to subscribe, for example. And that's a very sophisticated, deep level of product analytics that's quite hard to get out of something like a Google Analytics or an Adobe. And in one of the later talks, you'll hear my colleague Christoph deep dive into an example in that space. And then you've got businesses that just have different commercial models. So subscription businesses, I don't know how popular these are over here, but in the UK, every week there seems to be a new one. You subscribe to coffee, subscribe to meal delivery kits, subscribe to a little box of cereal to nibble between your meals, subscribe to have your razors delivered to you. These are businesses that are fundamentally interested in questions about churn and retention and user acquisition across a 1-month free trial. And again, those are quite hard things to do. They're not really built to be done with the traditional analytics tool sets. So I think it's pretty clear that if you're running a business that doesn't fit with the data model that's provided by your one-size-fits-all analytics providers, you're going to have to look for something else, something like Snowplow. But what's interesting is we have another big category of users that are media companies, that are retailers, that are using Snowplow. So they're often using us alongside their digital analytics providers. And it's interesting to think, well, why are these guys looking after using us, given they're so well served by the competition? And if we look at these guys, we see a number of common themes across what they're trying to do. So one is, these companies are often trying to do unified reporting across all their different platforms and channels. So we've been working with The Economist in the UK and for months, maybe years now, and they very simply want to understand how engaged their users are. They're not particularly interested in whether they're engaged on the mobile app or on the website. I mean, they do want to get in to understand that, but they want to generally score their users based on how engaged they are and what that means for how they treat them when it comes to subscription renewal time. The other interesting thing that we see across this user base is increasing adoption of more advanced analytics techniques. And the ones that get the most press and attention are those around artificial intelligence and machine learning. Related to that, we see a lot of interest in predictive analytics. So predictive analytics is a really interesting area. Some of the most actionable insight that we see people delivering with the data come from applying predictive analytics techniques. So asking questions like, which are the users that we've just acquired who are most likely to develop into high-value users? What are the sets of actions we can take that best encourage them to become higher value? Which are the users that are most likely to churn, and at what stage in their user journey do we want to intervene in that journey to have maximum impact on their likelihood to churn? Okay, we've got this user here and now. Which of our products should we put in front of them that they're most likely to want to engage with? Or which item of content are they most likely to want to read or share? So the predictive analytics is sometimes done with ML or AI. So there's a bit of a link there. And there's a link between both of them and the development of data-driven applications. So when I was starting out in data analytics, people were primarily using data to do insight, but now more and more people aren't interested in just plotting a graph. They want to actually act on that data. And so developing real-time data-driven applications like personalization engines and marketing automation systems. If you see a user do X, Y, Z, target them with this message. If this is a high-value user and it looks like they're likely to churn, maybe let's send them a bottle of wine or something to re-engage them and get them back in our service. And I think once you're starting to adopt some of these more advanced techniques, actually it becomes more important that you have a really rich, highly structured, high quality data set ready to go, than that you've got all the bells and whistles and reporting functionality that a Google and Adobe provide, but the actual underlying data isn't quite where you need it to be to make these use cases work. So that's hopefully given you a flavor for some of the use cases that we see across our user base. And as I said, we'll dive into to some of them in a bit more detail in the following talks. I just want to spend, I think it's just one slide, talking about what the future holds for Snowplow. So what does our roadmap hold? So I mentioned when we were comparing our paid-for offering Snowplow Insights with our open source, how the paid-for offering is really geared around empowering this data team that we see in companies that typically are trying to empower their colleagues, their teams to work with data. And what we see is that team is typically struggling with a whole lot of workflow around setting up data collection, managing compliance, monitoring data quality, distributing different slices of data to different team members. And so we're very interested in investing in tools to help them manage that workflow. I think there's, for a lot of our history, the gaps in data technology have been around the data engineering side. Now we see that maturing a huge amount. We actually see there being a real need for tools to help businesses, especially larger businesses, use these underlying tools to have an effect. And a lot of that is around these core workflows. We've got another work stream around making Snowplow easier to use. We want to make it easier to set up and run for both our open source and our paid-for users, and crucially reduce the time to value. And one of the big things that we're doing there is thinking about how we can package up solutions that sit on top of our stack that would help some of these companies with some of these specific use cases execute them more quickly than they're able to do at the moment. And the third work stream is support companies running Snowplow in more cloud environments. So for most of our history, most of our users have been running in AWS. We're getting pretty close to completing our GCP rollout, and we desperately like to get our technology running on Azure. We think a decision to use Snowplow shouldn't tie you to a specific cloud environment. You should be able to pick the one that suits, and if you want to change, pick up your data pipeline and drop it in the new environment. So that's everything that I wanted to cover. I hope I didn't take too long. Any questions?
Do you have any timeline for those forthcoming features, to make it easier to use? Do you have any time plan?
So the GCP is the easiest one to give a timeline on because that's pretty near completion. So we expect that in the next couple of months. The others are, I think, are going to be ongoing work streams, probably for years. So I think there's a lot we can do to make Snowplow easier, and we've just got to relentlessly focus on that. That hasn't been a focus of the business in the past, and I don't think we make it that easy to set up, as Simo can testify. And then similarly, if I think about all the different workflows that we want to be able to help data teams with, there's a lot of products that we want to build. There's a lot of workflow that we want to support. So that's plenty to keep us busy for the next 5 years at least.
How does the performance aspect work out? What do you need to have a high-performing system with Snowplow, like a huge farm servers? Let's say, I don't know the exact difference whether you what you provide for a paid service versus self-hosted. How would you start exploring this?
It's fundamentally the same way of exploring it if you're an open source user or a paid user. It's just we'd be exploring it with you if you're a paid user. So fundamentally, Snowplow is composed of different applications, and they're typically running on EC2 instances. So there'd be an application per EC2 instance, although we're moving to a containerized setup, which would enable more flexibility in how you scale up each of those resources and scale them down. So there's a question around what instance type each of those applications run on. Once you pick your instance types, you then need to scale it up and down with your varying traffic volumes and with the performance characteristics that you're looking to achieve. So we'll sit down with each each customer to get some idea of their volume of data, but also the level of fluctuation, and then how much latency they want to tolerate on the data in Kinesis, how much latency they want to tolerate for loading the data into the data warehouse, and then spec it out accordingly. So it's to talk on at length, I'm afraid. We've got tech ops guys who spend their whole lives thinking about tuning those sorts of things.
So I actually have a couple of questions for you.
Oh yes, please.
Preparing them. So I think one of the questions is about maturity. So you talk a lot about, you mentioned we're like taking data to the next level and augmenting something that's already there. Would you ever consider Snowplow to have a position in a company that is just getting started with analytics? Like choosing whether go with GA free or go with Piwik or whatever, but positioning Snowplow as a start analytics setup?
I'd always advise against using Snowplow in that setup. So we've had one customer that did decide from day one that they were going to use Snowplow as their system of records, and they were quite unique. They had a founding team that were very committed to data and using data to drive the business. They had a lot of experience with data from their previous ventures, and they were willing to invest a lot in that from day one. But I think they're the exception, not the rule. So I think my recommendation for most companies is to start with particularly the free tools. There's no it's wonderful that there are tools like Piwik and Google Analytics out there that you can get going with at a much lower cost than Snowplow, because even though the open source is out there, it still needs to be run on infrastructure that you're going to end up paying for. And then when you start hitting the limits of that, that's a really good sign to start looking at something like Snowplow. Otherwise, the risk is that you're using Snowplow, but you're not actually doing the things that you can't do in the other tools, and the other tools make the easier things easier.
So you mentioned limits. So one obvious place to get started with Snowplow is when you're running into quota limits and you want to think, should I dish out the $150,000 for GA360, or should I look into something else? But what other triggers do you think there are that, for example, if my company is using GA, what is a good trigger for me to start thinking about a good transition to an architecture like Snowplow offers?
So a really good trigger is you have a question that you want to answer, and you're not able to answer it with your current setup. So you want to compute a score for your user, an engagement score based on their behavior over the last month across a range of platforms and channels, or you want to start developing a profile so you can personalize the user journey. You just want to start collecting user level data, or maybe you want to start joining offline or online. And what we'll typically do is we'll work with companies to execute on just that use case. So just get Snowplow in place and just enough tracking to deliver that use case end to end and unlock the business value associated with that. And hopefully you've got some momentum that you can go back and build out the implementation. So we're really big believers in taking a very end user oriented approach to roll out and rolling out incrementally. We tend to advise against big re-architecting projects, trying to tear out your old analytics system and put in Snowplow instead. They're really boring, they're really long, and you're spending a lot of time just getting to where you were before.
Kind of like the classic business intelligence paradigm.
Yes.
So my last question is about, do you think there's a use case for running your basic, whether it's marketing analytics or product analytics or business analytics, parallel with Snowplow, and not even thinking about using Snowplow to replace those systems? Do you think there's a possibility to augment your existing analytics with Snowplow?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I used to say that it's always sensible to start building and collecting your own data set. So at the point you reach that level of maturity, you've got a data set that's ready to go. But I don't know if I'd recommend it anymore. Data's a bit odd. If data's just sitting around, if you're not actively using it to do anything, it kind of decays. It's a bit odd. There might be data collection problems that you only spot when you come to analyze the data, and then you've got 16 months of bad data. Yeah, I don't really believe it. I think you've got to actively work at all the data you're collecting as you're collecting it. Otherwise, it just sits around accruing cost. And so yeah, I used to think so, but I don't think I do anymore.
Because there are analytics platforms that are founded on the idea of this kind of agnostic data collection, so just collect everything that you can, and then hope that someday somebody builds a tool that makes sense out of all the data. So Snowplow is perhaps not geared towards that kind of you could do it probably, but it's...
Yeah, I just don't believe in that paradigm. I don't believe that putting stuff in a data lake, if you're not then taking it out and doing something useful, is achieving anything.
It gets difficult with things like GDPR imposing data retention limits. And
yeah, that's just a liability that's sat there waiting to come and bite you. So yeah, I think GDPR has really changed the paradigm. Before, if in doubt, collect, and if the worst comes to the worst, you can throw it away. Now you can't. That line of reasoning doesn't work anymore.
Any other questions, Yali?